Hello, everyone. I'm Eileen O'Connor from the Rockefeller Foundation. Together with our partners at E3G, we welcome those joining from around the world, and thanks to our speakers and guests for making the time for this session at a very busy time in the calendar. Right now, as we meet, the COVID-19 pandemic has not only killed millions and infected millions more, but it's also driving a devastating divergence. Developed countries are restarting growth with stimulus and early access to vaccines. Meanwhile, emerging economies are waiting on vaccines and losing decades of progress made with the help of those here today and many others against poverty, hunger, disease, and gender equality. As we speak, those at the World Health Organization, the ACT Accelerator, as well as public servants in capitals around the world, are working diligently to get people vaccinated and get the economy growing again. We applaud their efforts and we thank them for their dedication. But as the pandemic evolves, the Rockefeller Foundation and our partners sought to think about what the near and midterm future will require. In a crisis, the work consumes so much time and attention, it can be hard to think about what comes next. The foundation and its partners are therefore thrilled to share our action plan for financing global vaccination and sustainable growth. What we feel is a practical roadmap towards ending the pandemic and kickstarting a global recovery that is inclusive, equitable, and climate-centric. This plan lays out actionable steps leaders can take now to reach global vaccination levels of 70% by the end of next year. And to discuss this today, we have a tremendous lineup of speakers, including the Honorable Wally Adeyemo, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury, the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education, and the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Lord Stern, Jeffrey Sachs, Caroline Atkinson are also joining us today, as well as Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Director Vigliotti from the Treasury of the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance is also here today, and we're honored to have them all. But to start, I'll turn it over to Ellen McGirt from Fortune magazine to kick off the first session with an interview of Dr. Rajiv Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Thank you, Eileen, and hello, everyone. I'm Ellen McGirt. I'm a senior editor at Fortune, where I wear many hats, including establishing the Race and Equity Beat some 5 years ago now. But the hat I'm wearing today is one of concerned global citizen looking for hope and some action steps. That's why I'm honored to be here today in conversation with Dr. Rajiv Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, to discuss the foundation's new action plan for global vaccination and sustainable growth. Dr. Shah, it's so great to be with you today. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Ellen. We look forward to this.
So I've been poring over this plan, and I'm really happy you're here to walk us all through it. And one big number stood out for me: 45 billion can end the pandemic in 20 months. I want to get to that in just a second. But if we could start, that's really impressed me here is that this is a plan that really centers on some practical financial steps that global leaders can take and that everyone can understand, that can end the pandemic, but assure a more inclusive, sustainable, green, equitable future. And that's really what we want to do. Can we start with some big context here? What exactly is this plan designed to do, and why is it so timely?
Well, Ellen, this plan is designed to avoid a great divergence. We are on the cusp of a great divergence. And what I mean by that is if you look at how COVID-19 has affected the global community, it has potentially moved 500 million people back under an expanded definition of the poverty line. It's potentially wiped out 1 or 2 decades of gains in global health and health equity for the world's poorest people. And as a result, and as a consequence, we know that the vaccine, which is a durable and important solution, is rolling out aggressively in places like the United States. It's rolling out perhaps less aggressively, but fairly quickly in other parts of the world. It is not rolling out fast enough in most of the emerging and developing nations on the planet. And in fact, when you look at how much the wealthier countries have invested in supporting their economies and in fighting this pandemic, it's been 20 to 30% of GDP that's been public investment in fiscal and monetary measures. If you look at emerging economies, it's about 6%. Developing countries, it's about 2%. So the result is we may effectively move beyond COVID-19 in the wealthier nations in the world, but we may still have millions and millions of cases in emerging and developing economies that would represent both a tragic outcome for those countries and its people, and a real threat to the global economy from new variants that can overwhelm and ultimately discredit the current vaccination response.
So you've outlined a terrifying scenario, and I can just tell you my basic reporting shows that you're right. We're poised to lose some important momentum and certainly to turn around a terrible situation. So let's talk specifically about your global vaccination strategy and the financing of the response to that. How does that work?
Well, right now we know the global health experts and institutions like the World Health Organization have come together through the ACT Accelerator and identified a short-term funding gap of north of $20 billion for this year to mount a full and thorough and rapid vaccination effort across the planet. We actually looked at what would it take to end this pandemic via vaccination, meaning achieve 70% coverage throughout the planet, every developing nation, every emerging economy. And to do that by the end of 2022 will in fact require an investment of $45 billion. Now, that may sound like, and it is, a large investment. It would be the largest single investment in global health perhaps ever made. But when you compare it to the trillions of dollars of lost economic value, in fact, estimates indicate that we would lose $9.2 trillion of economic value if we do not pursue this type of plan. It's actually an incredibly efficient and effective way to spend money, and it's a way to both ensure that we lift up those who are poor and vulnerable and protect wealthier countries that hopefully will be beyond COVID-19 in a few months to a year.
This is not particularly my beat, but I do consider myself an amateur watcher of unique philanthropic financial tools, but special drawing rights was not something I was familiar with. Can you tell us what those are and how that was going to help with this particular effort?
Sure. Well, as you know, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created as Bretton Woods institutions in order to stabilize and support global economic coordinated enterprises and initiatives. And this is, in fact, one of the purposes of the International Monetary Fund. The IMF, one of its tools is to allocate special drawing rights, effectively a reserve currency made possible by the shareholders' commitments to the International Monetary Fund. And they can commit, and their executive directors have indicated they should commit an additional $650 billion in special drawing rights, or SDRs, to their member countries. Of that, some proportion of those new SDRs, or again, think of it as just reserves that are handed to nations, some proportion of those reserves can be donated back to the IMF, and specifically to the Poverty Reduction Growth Trust at the IMF. And we are calling for, consistent with many, many others, donations of at least $100 billion worth of SDRs. And then of that $100 billion, about 40 to 50 billion of it could be used to specifically accelerate an urgent global vaccination effort. And so that's how you get to $45 billion. It's how you get there rather quickly. There are lots of details and some real innovations that will be needed to turn $45 billion of donated special drawing rights into vaccines that actually reach the arms of every man, woman, and child across the planet. But it's possible. And I'm just proud to be part of both an organization and a group of partners that have come together from around the world to do this work and conceptualize these solutions. solutions, that'll make a huge difference for humanity if we get this right and act boldly right now.
I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the big dream of sustainable coming out of this more sustainably. There's a lot at stake here, but before we do, just a little bit more on the SDRs and what's it going to take to get that done, because sounds like a perfect idea hiding in plain sight, but it is going to require people to work together who may not have been working together. And especially at a time when big organizations and countries and governments have been battling trust issues in the public eye, and where misinformation and disinformation has just put everybody on edge. What do you think it's going to take to get this done?
Well, you said it. It's going to take cooperation. It's going to take working together to help each other out. It'll take geopolitical cooperation across the G20 nations that account for the majority of the shareholding of the IMF to make this issuance of SDRs possible. It'll take real cooperation amongst those wealthier nations that will receive their extra reserves and say, boy, we have a Federal Reserve. We don't need these extra IMF reserves, so let's donate them back to the IMF so they can be used for nations that really need them. And then it'll take cooperation amongst those nations and all of the international institutions that represent global health, the World Health Organization, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, and so many others, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and say, what's the best, most efficient way to use this additional capital to actually manufacture, acquire, and distribute COVID-19 vaccines to those who are vulnerable. And then it'll take cooperation on the ground in countries so that public and private partners are working together with really, really often threadbare health systems to make sure they have the resources and the focus and the drive to reach every single vulnerable person with the COVID-19 vaccine so that the world can move beyond this crisis. It takes a lot of cooperation. The good news is we've seen at times of crises, people come together and do extraordinary things. After the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the IMF was granted the ability to do additional SDRs, and I think did about 260 billion. So there's a precedent for that. Over the last 20-25 years, Gavi and its 70 plus national partners have immunized, hundreds of millions of inoculations that have saved millions of children's lives. That seemed impossible at the time. I was part of the effort that helped set up all of those institutions, and it was hard back then. We can look back 20 years later and say this made a huge difference in the nature of, human kindness to each other and in child survival and mortality. So we have examples of success we can look to, but it will take an extraordinary level of political cooperation and operational partnership to make this successful by the end of 2022.
The big dream is coming back better. That's one of the things that I hear a lot in corporate life, not just building back, but building back better. And that can mean a variety of things in terms of stakeholders and the environment and race and equity and all of that. What is a global recovery that's green and equitable look like to you?
Well, a truly green, equitable global recovery will focus on making sure every single family around the planet can participate in that recovery. It would be fully inclusive. And we know that COVID-19 and the way it has caused economic crisis around the world has really both uncovered and exacerbated the extraordinary inequities in almost every society. Here in the United States, minority communities have been hit so much harder. Lower income and wage workers have been hit so much harder. And persistent unemployment risks in those communities threaten to drag down our own recovery. That same dynamic exists in nation after nation after nation. And so, you could look at big countries like India and you'll see the same disparities. You can look at relatively small scale nations, take Rwanda, for example, that has had a pretty robust response, and you'll still see the same dynamic there. So really, equity and inclusion have to be the hallmarks of this recovery. And the only way we'll get there is ensuring that there are jobs and opportunities for people to earn income as the world makes this pivot to a climate smart future and as we recommit ourselves to ensure that this type of global pandemic never happens again.
So before I let you go, can we talk a little bit about global climate? You just touched on it, but I think we need to dig in a little bit more here because that is a big piece of coming back better. What does it look like to build back with jobs that are related to making sure that we hit our global climate goals?
Well, the way to get there is to really invest in economic transformation as part of economic recovery. I mentioned earlier that wealthier countries have been able to provide 20, 25, sometimes 30% of GDP as fiscal and monetary actions. In the United States, we're actually debating, another $2 trillion of expenditure now to make an infrastructure investment that would reshape the American economy. In the same way, other nations should have the opportunity to make those types of investments now. We know that digital infrastructure will help connect and lift up even the poorest families in rural North India. We know that investing in renewable energy, in particular in parts of Africa, will both create jobs and provide electricity to more than 1 billion people who still live in the dark and as a result don't have the ability to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps and participate in a growing global economy. These are the kinds of inclusive green investments we need to make with the resources enabled by the SDR program, but also with the reimagining of the institutions of global financial cooperation. We have to treat this as a once in a lifetime threat, but also a once in a lifetime opportunity to rebuild an equitable world that is much more sustainable so that our children inherit a planet that's just much more fair and much more likely to persist than the one we would otherwise hand to them.
I know this action plan is just one of many analysis to come. What can we expect to come next?
Well, I think next you'll have to see the foundation and so many other partners will work together to really specify, how an SDR issuance can mechanically turn into more vaccines distributed to nations and used for inoculations, even in difficult to reach communities. That action plan is forthcoming under the auspices of the ACT Accelerator, which currently is led by, the formal health institutions, the South African government and Norway. I think you'll also see more specific proposals for how to re-energize the use of the Bretton Woods institutions, development banks in particular, cooperation between those development banks and the private sector to really make a green recovery something that's possible in a global context. A number of us studied deeply how the United States and the Western world reacted to World War II. And it was a period of time where people reached out, thought big, they were creative and bold. And the Marshall Plan, the creation of the World Bank, the invention of the International Monetary Fund, the commitment to make sure that everybody had a chance to lift themselves up was a big part of how the world saw the future of stability and security going into the Cold War. And similarly, we have to think of ourselves as going into a tremendous global challenge right now in terms of health and climate. And we have to be bold and ambitious in what we seek to do. And hopefully the plans that you see come forth over the next months will substantiate that, make it practical, and most importantly, include the voices of the institutions that need to implement the plan so that actual change and results are delivered on the ground.
We're going to have to leave it there, Dr. Shah. Thank you so much. Good luck. Keep us posted. Fortune's very interested in this story. And now I'm going to hand things over to Claire from E3G for the next important conversation.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen. And hello to all those watching at home. My name's Claire Healy and I run the DC office of E3G. We work on the diplomacy needed to halve emissions in a decade for a climate safe world. You may be wondering why, therefore, we're working with the Rockefeller Foundation on an action plan calling for financing of the global vaccination rollout and COVID recovery. The fact is, we won't make enough progress on climate unless and until the world cooperates to get this pandemic under control and help economies and everyone get back on their feet. Raj spoke of the need for geopolitical cooperation, and we have an excellent panel now to explore this concept. I'd like to welcome on this virtual stage Vera Songwe and Caroline Atkinson to sort of unpack this concept a little bit with me. So thank you for joining us, Vera, and for Caroline. And we'll be joined in a moment, I think, by Lord Stern and Director General Vigliotti had to give her apologies. She got called into a G20 negotiation. We'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment. So Vera, I'd like to start with you and ask you sort of how you received this action plan that Rockefeller published today. The title is One for All. And I'd like to ask you, did this resonate with you in any way?
So sorry for this technical difficulty, and so happy to have Caroline Atkinson back with us, as well as Sir Nicholas Stern, who has joined the conversation. So Caroline and so Nicholas, what do you think of in this report is the most important points people should take away, and why has it been so difficult to finance a global, particularly a global vaccination campaign right now? Because we know that unless everyone is safe, no one is safe.
I think the focus has been so strongly in so many countries on the internal, and they're struggling with their own rescue programs, keeping people at work, and they've not yet sufficiently lifted their eyes to the dangers that come from the world as a whole. You know, that if none of us, if someone is not safe, then nobody is safe. That realization, I think, has not been sufficiently embedded. It's due to the internal focus, but it does mean that this kind of public discussion to lift our eyes, not only to our mutual interdependence, that it's in the self-interest of all countries to help others. Actually, they shouldn't need to be told that. They should do it anyway if it's the right thing to do. But if we can show that much more strongly in public discussion, then I think it will help in the process of lifting the eyes.
And Caroline, you were at the IMF.
If I can just
right, hop in.
I was just going to jump in and say I completely agree with Nick, if I may call you Nick, Lord Stern, and
Nick.
And he of course has been a great leader. To me, the One for All title of the plan does resonate, but it also, in a weird way, feels out of sync with where the world is. We've seen by divisions. Obviously, you know, I'm American despite my accent. I live in the US, and we know that there have been big divisions in the United States. But I do believe that President Biden is right, that the US is back and that there will be leadership. But we see even in the US that there is reluctance to help with vaccinating the rest of the world until we've got people vaccinated at home. I think that will happen quickly, so that problem will be over. And the United States is also giving a fair amount of money to COVAX. And we've now announced yesterday a vaccine head diplomat for vaccine diplomacy, Gail Smith. But I want to highlight two big problems that I think require leadership if we are to get to a vaccinate for all. And these are different from what we had after the global financial crisis. And one of them is sort of well known and well discussed, and that's the US-China split. And at the time of the global financial crisis, it was not particularly well advertised, but the United States and China, economic and financial and strategic people on both sides, officials on both sides, were working very closely together. They both countries saw the rescue of the international financial system as in their interests. And right now we have a division on the very issues of health, on the issue of health. And then my second one is, and Nick will know much more about this, it's between the UK and Europe. And that is very important, and within Europe, but that's very important for the G7 that the UK is hosting. We see these terrible fights on vaccine exports, vaccine collaboration against the backdrop of really bad, what seems to be bad feelings over Brexit. And I just remember the leadership that Gordon Brown gave to the world in 2009. And I wonder if the UK government is going to be able to give that kind of leadership in the G7 this time around. And in particular, I think that there needs to be special diplomacy with Europe. And maybe the US can help a bit there.
Mm-hmm. And I would remind people that we will be speaking to the Right Honorable Gordon Brown later on in this session. So, Nicholas, too, we've talking about vaccines, but also switching to the global economic recovery that's required. So many are now back into extreme poverty because of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. You just came from talking to a coalition of finance ministers for climate action. I know Secretary Kerry is on his first overseas trip talking about climate. So is there a shared understanding of the need for a COVID economic recovery package that supports delivering not only on the strategic development goals, but also on the Paris climate commitments?
I think so, but with three important qualifications. Before I go into them, though, I just wanted to echo what Caroline said about fractiousness over, as it were, the nationality of a vaccine. The idea that if it's produced in one country, it is the property only of that country is in violation of the one for all principle. We have to go to scale to produce these things. We have to concentrate. We have to get ingredients, if you use the term, from very many different places. And vaccine nationalism on the production side, as well as on the consumption side, is very dangerous. And I hope that the UK will rise to the occasion. Many of us in the UK are, I think, pressing on that. At the moment, I think it's getting a bit more gentle on that front, but it's important we keep up the pressure, saying that vaccines are just, if they're produced somewhere, they're not necessarily uniquely owned by where they're produced. But to get back to your question, is there a shared understanding on the COVID recovery packages? I think there is, but here are the three qualifications. We're still in rescue phase. Rescue phase is looking after jobs and activities as they currently are. It means, if you like, taking a photograph of the economy as it currently is and trying to maintain that as best you can. That's what rescue means. And of course, the economy as it is brown mostly, not especially green. So I think that commitment to doing things in a sustainable, climate-friendly way has to be embodied in the rescue package. We can't insist. So it has to be embodied in the recovery package. We can't insist that it's everywhere in the rescue package. But now is the moment to move from rescue to recovery. And that is the moment to press on internationalism as manifested in the vaccine story as the underpinning of how we move forward on the recovery story. The second qualification is, I think, the urgency and scale of what is required has not yet sunk in. This decade is absolutely decisive. The world's infrastructure will double in the next 15 or 20 years. If that new infrastructure looks anything like the infrastructure that we have now, then say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. That infrastructure we build around the world, a big part of it in emerging market and developing countries, will be decided upon in the next few years. The next 5 years or so will shape the infrastructure investments of the next 15 or 20. I don't think the urgency and scale is embedded strongly enough, and I don't think the internationalism is embedded strongly enough. Many developing and emerging market countries are under deep financial and economic stress. Moving to sustainable investment around the world means doing that everywhere. This is not a zero-sum game, and this is a crucial moment where the rich countries and the IFIs have to be enabled to do this. The rich countries and the IFIs give much stronger support to the developing world and to the world of emerging markets. So there's a shared understanding of the importance of what we have to do, but not yet in terms of urgency, scale, and collaboration.
So, Nick, on that point, and again, apology technical difficulties a moment ago, but on that point, I'd really like to bring in Vera. Vera, UNICA put out two, I thought, very insightful reports on this very topic, where the first one you had these phased approaches calling on, like, with very practical actions, and the latter report calling for an African focused green recovery. What's your view of the level of collaboration we've seen so far? And what are you calling for? What are you hoping to see this year in terms of the geopolitics of cooperation?
Thank you again, and sorry for the technical mix-ups, and thank you for bringing me back on. Listen, I was able to hear Lord Stern, Caroline. I'd stand on your permission, and I fully agree. I think that what we said
Nick,
was,
Vera,
can
please.
you hear us? Yes. Oh, okay. Yes, you can hear me. So I think what Lord Stern says is rescue. We call response, and we're saying that we're still in the response phase of this crisis. So we talk about the 3 Rs, kind of response, recovery, and reset. And we believe that for a lot of the emerging market economies, we are still in the response phase. And I think, like for climate, there is a sort of total lack of urgency in the health pandemic response and the vaccination response. And I do want to say, because Caroline, you said it, I could listen to you, but they were not able to bring me back on screen. The only continent that is actually allowing for vaccines to leave the continent and go someplace else is Africa. Johnson & Johnson produces in South Africa, and those vaccines will soon begin to be exported to Europe. If you needed a one-for-all example, I think that Africa is demonstrating it. We have not seen that demonstrated in other places, and I think we really do need emergency and quickly. When you look at the numbers, as we speak today, only 70,000 vaccines have actually gotten into the arms of people on the continent, 2 vaccines, and we have about 1.8 million people that have gotten one. So when you think about 1.8 million people on a continent of 1.3 billion, you just realize that the one for all is not working. And so we do need to look at it differently. And when you move then to the climate, and this is, I think, an integral part of our 3 Rs: response, recovery, and reset. If we cannot get the vaccines in, it's very difficult to even begin to think about how we do the recovery phase, how we get the resources for recovery, and then let alone the reset, which is essentially maybe re-looking at global financial institutions, global pandemic response institutions. Because as I say, yes, this is a health pandemic, but soon we will get a climate one in full-blown scale, and then maybe eventually a cybersecurity one. And we cannot wait for the kinds of sort of 1 year later to be still thinking that we are in the response phase. So what ECA is saying is, for the green recovery, and thank you very much to Oxford University and Lord Stern, we're working together. We've shown and we've demonstrated the value add of adding more jobs if we decided to go in a sustainable recovery. 250% in South Africa, 180% more jobs will be created if the recovery were green. But difficult to talk about the recovery if the 100 billion that we're asking for the response hasn't come. So as it is the weekend of the IMF World Bank, or the week of the IMF World Bank meetings, we're still hoping that the 100 billion that the African finance ministers asked for Africa will come in, so that we can actually begin to finalize this response phase and move to a recovery.
So on that, Caroline, you were at the IMF, I think, at the last financial crisis, and then in the White House from 2011, overseeing these diplomatic processes. So you know a thing or two about how to get these ideas into the bloodstream of these diplomatic processes so countries can cooperate. I hijack that sense of urgency and sort of the leadership that you talked about before to get these ideas picked up this year. It seems a very packed agenda. Each of these things, vaccination rollout, COVID economic recovery, building resilience to future shocks, and decarbonising, are all huge agenda items, each and to themselves. How do we package it together to get it done through the rhythm of the year? What would your advice be?
That's a great question. I think it's useful to pay attention to the calendar and to pay attention to who are going to be important players showing leadership, and I referred obviously to Gordon Brown earlier. I think I'm biased because of having been in the United States, but I think the United States can deliver leadership and pull people along when it's operating in a appropriate way, and that will be. And I'm hopeful that that's. And we'll hear from Wally Adeyemo from shortly. I'm hopeful that the United States will take these promises, which after all are the core of the domestic agenda of President Biden, and try to generalize them. The second thing is in the G7. G7 excludes a lot of the countries that you need to have engaged in resolving these problems. It doesn't include China, it doesn't include India, it doesn't include Brazil, Indonesia, important for, certainly very important for climate. So the G7 does tend to have a special role reaching out to Africa. And I would hope that the United Kingdom, even though there's a question about its aid now, that the United Kingdom will certainly give a push in the G7 context for help for Africa. But then moving to the G20, I think that includes many of the key countries. It only has, unfortunately, South Africa from Africa, but many of the others are there. And India, a massive producer of vaccines, is at the table in the G20. China, also a big producer of vaccines, and we really need to get China's vaccines sort of transparently evaluated and cleared, is at the table. The way that you get what you're doing is, and the Rockefeller Foundation is doing, is absolutely the right thing. Raise the public profile, speak to people privately, and then understand that all sorts of bureaucrats in all of these governments need to work together to figure out what's doable. And leaders can't do that detailed work, but they can give a broad overall push. So having some big goals, I think, is a good way to go about it. And then you need to have the officials filling in the way to get to those goals. And obviously, sorry, just to say, I worked with leaders. I was representing the White House, and that's a very powerful place, especially for many countries. But the role of finance ministers, especially in the G20, where they have a very specific set of meetings and they connect up with the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and others, using that finance channel is obviously also very important. I'm not so fond of the idea that we should be trying to create new architecture. I'm more of a let's use what we've got and the connections that we've got. It involves a lot of, if not travel, Zoom calls, work, and direction as to the end goal for different countries.
So talking about goals, Nick, if I may, you're working very closely with the UK as president this year of the G7 process and also COP26 alongside Italy. What's your feeling? Do they have a integrated framework bold enough to what as rate of decarbonisation we need over the next decade?
I think they do. The UK, I don't always agree with what the UK government does. I'm independent, London School of Economics. But I do think that the commitment on climate is clear and strong. And it was the first G7 country to declare for net zero nearly 2 years ago now. It has quite a strong action plan, so-called 10-point plan to get there. It has the milestones along the way in terms of the 5-year carbon budgets, which are renewed, 15 years ahead. So I think that commitment is genuine. The commitment to COP26, the UK fought hard to get to be one of the partners with Italy in COP26. I think that's very clear and genuine, and it's going to be a centerpiece of G7. I've been asked through the Prime Minister and the G7 Sherpa to prepare an independent overall story for the G7. It's independent, so the government can take it or leave it, but obviously we stay in close touch. And there, the investment and interdependence are at center stage in the story that we're telling. The world has to get anywhere near the Paris goals. It has to be investing another 2 percentage points or so of GDP, more in some countries, particularly emerging markets and developing countries. And it has to do that in a different kind of way from the past. Looking back, many countries 15, 20 years ago, rates of investment were 2 or 3% higher than now. They've drifted down in that very bad decade we had before COVID struck. So we have to think about the practicalities of ramping up investment and changing its composition so that it's very different from the investment that came before. And that will drive us out of the COVID recession and drive us on to a much more sustainable path. If you like to use Vera's language, it will take us to the recovery. The recovery designed in that way is part of and takes us on to the reset to a very different economy. So that's the story. That's what we have to do. We don't need a consumption-led recovery. It has to be investment and of different kind. And then you go straight to the internationalism, because that has to be everywhere. And the stresses on the poorer parts of the world, on the economy and finance, are severe. And it's going to need the IFIs expanded strongly in order to get us the multipliers on their own resources, and then the multipliers with the private sector that can make that happen. That's why the SDRs are so important, primarily first for the vaccine, but also for the rest of the recovery. The MDBs have to have their ability to lend, their firepower, expanded quickly now and sustained, because this is a decadal and more investment story.
So on that point of resources, I love the storyline. I love the rhetoric we have about building back better and a global green recovery. How do we make rhetoric manifest? And we've got to talk about resources. So for the few minutes we have left, I do want to dig in a bit about resources. Vera, in your reports, what are you calling for in terms of the resources the G7 and others have to step up with? And I'd love to do a quick round. Caroline, perhaps you could say something about how those public resources are leveraged from private finance. And then Nick, just end with you talking about the DFIs, like expansion and reform. What did you think of the recommendation in the Rockefeller paper about recycling some of the SDRs, but also they called for a review of the capital adequacy rules. So we'll do a quick round on the resources. Where's the money going to come from? Vera.
Look, thank you very much. I think we have been calling for the SDRs, the special drawing rights, for a year now. We do have 650 that is we hope will be issued this week or approved. We are calling for 25% of the 650 to go to emerging markets so that we can meet the 100 billion. We're actually saying, hopefully 25% of at least the new, but maybe the new and the unused. If you use the new and the unused, you have 650 plus 280. Which will be the resources. But it must include, again, these resources coming from the SDR are once in a lifetime resources, or once in a decade, at least we get them every 10 years, we get a crisis. We need to use them in a way where we use them to create even more resources. The leverage capacity cannot be one-to-one. We have to be able to crowd in the private sector with these resources. So the Economic Commission for Africa is proposing something called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which will be able to crowd in, we hope, more private sector. We know that only 2% of the resources available for renewable investment across the world are coming to the continent because of the cost of capital. We hope that if we can get some SDRs to leverage some of that, we can do more faster and quicker. So SDRs as the key, DSSI extension, of course, is the second one that we hope. And then for the MDBs, as Nick was saying, we need new resources. We do not need replacement resources. We can't take from education to put into climate. We do need additional. So hopefully that the MDBs are recapitalized.
So on that leveraging resources point, Caroline, in the couple of minutes, what do you think about how we leverage for real this time private finance?
Well, the first point is that I think private finance is ready to do that. There is more and more evidence that there have been big inflows into so-called ESG funds. Many investors are waking up to the importance of climate change. And I think there are the incentives, private capital will go where there are incentives to go. One part of the incentive is the return, and the other part is the risk. And what public capital can do is take away some of the risk, and that's the best way to leverage the flows of private capital. The other thing that I think would be really important is transparency about the use of resources and about how we measure what is environmentally sound? Are there agreements on that? And that's an area where there's a lot of work going on now, as there is on the separate issue, although everything's related, of gender investing. And those are important areas where the private sector is working on it, but they need some help from the public sector. And then the final thing that the public sector really needs to do is R&D. Basic research, developmental research in some of the, the green hydrogen, some of the more, I don't want to say crazy, but some of the more ambitious targets. You really need public investment.
Just like on the vaccine. Final word to you, Nick. Just very briefly on the MDBs. What about this idea of balance sheet optimization and an external review of capital adequacy rules? Do you think that's a go this year or not?
I think we have to recognize this year that we're going to need that over the coming 2 or 3 years so that we can sustain the strong investment that we need right through this decade. It's no good just pressurizing the MDBs to lend more in this next 2 or 3 years. They will up their lending. They are upping their lending, but then they've got to sustain that raised lending right through the decade, and they'll need the capital adequacy to do that. We need the SDRs this year, and I think we're going to need another one of the same size next year. We've got to recycle in the right direction, particularly to the poorest countries, but also to many of the emerging market countries where much of the investment, the sustainable investment will take place, where much of the natural capital lies. First and foremost, developing countries, but also looking beyond. But that capital adequacy review is absolutely crucial to sustaining the investment right through this decade and not just in the next couple of years. So I think the Rockefeller report has got it right.
Okay, well, I feel like we barely scratched the surface, but I do think there are future installments of the Rockefeller Foundation's action report digging deeper into these other ideas. But for now, I want to thank you all, like Vera, Caroline, and Nick. And I think I'm going to hand over the microphone to Raj Shah, President of the Rockefeller Foundation, to hear from a very special guest. So Raj, I feel like, we barely scratched the surface, but picking up your theme of the geopolitics of cooperation, we're keen to hear from your next guest if he's persuaded, and they're going to lead this, the implementation of these ideas that you're proposed. So Raj, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you for bringing such an outstanding panel together to discuss such an important issue. We will now, let me welcome everyone who has joined us in this virtual gathering. I look forward to when we get back to the days of doing these at least somewhat in person. But we are going to continue our discussion of the global response to COVID-19 and the Rockefeller Foundation's new action plan to finance an end to this pandemic and to stimulate a global recovery. And our guest of honor here, and whom I'm honored to welcome, is Wale Adeyemo. Wale, of course, you all know, has recently been sworn in as the United States Deputy Treasury Secretary just a few weeks ago. Wale is no stranger to the Treasury Department. He served as a senior advisor and deputy chief of staff there during the Obama administration when I got to see his work. He also has served as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics and Deputy Director of the NEC, the National Economic Council, at which time he was the president's representative to the G7 and G20. So we are thrilled to have you here with us, Wally, and we are grateful for your leadership. We're particularly excited about what you intend to do going forward. And so this is, so I welcome you here. This is just your second week at the department and maybe your first public engagement. If so, we're deeply honored that you chose to do that with us at the Rockefeller Foundation. But after being out of government for 4 years, what has surprised you most about re-entry and about the impact that COVID-19 has had on international and domestic economies?
Well, Raj, let me start out by saying a word of thanks to you and to Rockefeller for putting on this this conversation. This is an important topic and one that deserves the attention that you're giving to it, and one that I look forward to working with you and your colleagues on going forward. This is my first public event, and I think it's an important first public event because it speaks to the importance of dealing with COVID, not just in the United States, but around the world. I rejoined the Treasury Department a few weeks ago, and at the beginning of COVID, I was actually in the south side of Chicago. And sitting there, I could see the disparate impact that the COVID was having on marginalized communities in Chicago. And what's been sad and difficult has been the fact that as you move out and you look at the entire country, the same thing that was happening on the south side of Chicago is happening in cities and in urban and in rural areas throughout the country. You're seeing marginalized communities devastated by the public health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19. And what's true in the United States is true around the world as we see communities suffering throughout the world from the pandemic. And this is why the president was so committed to making sure that we passed the American Rescue Plan and also making sure that we vaccinated as many Americans as quickly as possible. And we're seeing success. Over 100 million shots have been put in people's arms. More than 130 million checks have been given to Americans that help them get through the economic hardship caused by this crisis. And this is why the United States has supported a reallocation of the SDR in order to make sure that the world also has access to the resources that they will need to deal with this crisis. One thing that we know is that the COVID does not respect national borders, does not respect state borders or city borders. And it's important that in order to deal with the virus, we need to deal with it globally, not just in one country.
Well, Wally, that's an excellent start. And the fact that you started with Chicago is so important. You know, African Americans have been so disproportionately affected by the economic and health crisis in the United States. And as you point out, we see the same in Brazil and throughout of Africa and India, all over the world. This has really exacerbated inequities. The SDR mechanism will provide, significant additional reserve capital. What is your vision for how to turn this SDR action into vaccinations that reach difficult to reach communities and into the core health investment required to sort of stabilize this still out of control pandemic, particularly in the emerging world?
Raj, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's one in which we're going to want to work closely with other countries to make sure that the SDRs are used in a transparent fashion to address the challenges that low-income countries face around the world, including vaccination. When you think about the SDR, it speaks to the power of the international financial institutions, which have been at the forefront of making sure that we address the global pandemic around the world. It is important that we continue to invest in those institutions, and I appreciate the work that Rockefeller has done to help us think through how to do that in a way that makes sure that we get resources to those that need it most. Our plan is largely to make sure that we have an allocation of SDRs that will provide support, and that support goes to low-income and emerging market economies that need help addressing the pandemic, be it in terms of getting shots in people's arms or budget support in order to make sure that their economies are continue to function. We recognize that this pandemic is global and the impacts will be long lasting, and that we need to make sure that we provide the financial resources to countries in order to make sure that they're able to continue to grow and to provide for their citizens going forward.
And you have been an advocate, and yesterday Secretary Yellen was clear in her speech at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that if we don't make this investment in emerging and developing countries, it could very well undermine the fragile recovery because new variants would come back and undermine us in the United States. When you kind of look at it that way, does that create and does Treasury and do you have a point of view yet on the reallocation of SDRs? Obviously, this initial allocation goes to shareholders. This report calls for a fairly significant reallocation from countries that don't really need additional reserves to those that need to get money to move quickly to do the vaccination. How do you think that's going to play out? And can you say something about the geopolitical situation in this current moment on that issue?
So, Raj, I think, as you know, Secretary Yellen gave a speech yesterday that outlined our international priorities, which included the idea that the United States wants to work hand in hand with our allies multilaterally to ensure that we meet the needs of this moment, including ending the pandemic. That requires us to do things like think through what reallocation looks like in order to make sure that we can support the needs of emerging and developing economies going forward. But that can't be all that we do. We also need to think through what it looks like for us to continue to look at debt relief options for these countries to make sure that they're able to have sustainable economies going forward. Fundamentally, we believe that in order for us to defeat the pandemic, it's going to require us to have a global effort. The president has made clear to all of us that it's critical that we lead that effort in the United States because we know that ending the pandemic is not only important to our national security, but it's also important to our economic prosperity.
Well, and you did mention the American Jobs Plan and the prior stimulus actions. The United States has committed, already $6 trillion to stabilizing our economy and investing in a recovery. Do you think beyond the issue of vaccination, do you have a view as to how developing and emerging economies could generate resources to make those types of investments? And what would your priorities be for the leaders of those economies as they consider making those investments, potentially with some of these reallocated and allocated SDRs?
The president has laid out a vision for the types of investments we need to make in America, especially in the jobs package that he recently announced, where we're investing in infrastructure in the United States. One statistic is that the world has $94 trillion in infrastructure needs between now and 2040. We're making an investment here in the United States of $2 trillion that will invest in our infrastructure. And we think that the plan that we're outlining in the United States is one that speaks to the needs we have around the world. The plan calls for investments in traditional infrastructure like highways and roads and ports, but also in the infrastructure of the future, like broadband and things of that nature. It also is an investment in R&D, which is going to be critical to making sure that we unlock America's potential in the 21st century. And finally, a number of investments that will unlock the potential of American workers and invest in our care economy. These are the types of investments that need to be made around the world and the types of investments that we're advocating for in forums like the G20 and the G7 in order to make sure that we unlock the potential of the global economy. The United States in 2021 will go and become an engine of growth for the world, and we look forward to seeing the growth in the United States help to stimulate growth around the world, because we know that in order for the global economy to grow, the United States needs to be doing well, and we're committed to taking the policy actions that allow us to do that.
Well, that's great to hear, and your leadership is going to be so critical on the world stage, and you're no stranger to the G7 or the G20. I'm struck by the estimate that without a bigger, more aggressive push on vaccination specifically, the world will lose $9+ trillion in economic value, and we all know that sits disproportionately on those who are more vulnerable. What do you believe are the challenges and the prospects of using the G7 and the G20 to motivate concerted global action? Do you feel, given your new role and given, I'm sure, notes of congratulations and partnership from your counterparts, do you feel there's a hunger to come together and rebuild these multilateral mechanisms, or do you feel, honestly pessimistic about the capacity of the world to act together to solve what are really global, common, shared problems?
Raj, you touched on it, but I think we have to be mindful of the challenge that we face. due to the pandemic, we expect up to 150 million people to move into extreme poverty, which is a reversal of a trend that we had seen going in the right direction for a long time. My sense is that the world wants to address this challenge, including at the G20 and the G7, and they're going to do it with the leadership of the United States. We're committed to working on these issues through the G7, the G20, and the multilateral development banks, because we know that fundamentally our security and our economic prosperity is tied to the security and the economic prosperity of people around the world. Doing that's going to take us making tough choices, like making investments in the future here in the United States, and also ensuring that countries are put in a position where they can make investments in their future, including the vaccination of their populations and ensuring that their economies grow in the 21st century.
Well, Wally, you've been a leader in government, you've been a leader in very important private financial institutions, and you've been private sector institutions, and you've been in philanthropy. And I think one of the challenges you will face is just bringing everyone together against that common vision. But you articulate it in such a clear and compelling manner. And you've done it before successfully. So we look forward to your continued leadership. Are there any challenges or any requests you have of the community that's here? Rockefeller Foundation is a global institution, and more important than that, we have great partners around the world. Some well-known economists who are your big supporters and fans, and others who are doing the hard work of vaccinating kids and adults in the farthest corners of the globe. And many of them are tuned in here. Is there any message you have for this community specifically? How can we be most helpful to the vision you just laid out?
One thing that I would say is that the most important thing that we need to do speaks to the question you asked, that we need to do this in partnership. The pandemic has demonstrated to us that there are threats to the world that go beyond our border, and that the only way that we can solve these threats is when we work together to do so. The private sector, governments, and foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation. And fundamentally, in order for us to deal with things like climate change and to deal with things like the pandemic and to make sure that the global economy grows, we're going to have to do it in partnership. Secretary Yellen yesterday laid out a speech that spoke to the U.S. economic agenda internationally. In order for us to accomplish these things, we know that we need to work with our allies and work multilaterally. The president's committed to doing this. America's committed to being a leader in an effort to make sure that the global economy grows in a way that promotes equality and moves against the forces that have led us to a growth pattern that has promoted inequality. But that's going to require us to come together as a global community and to think through how we use our resources to build a stronger economy that supports growth throughout the world and protects us from the risks that we face going forward. The Rockefeller Foundation and the private sector need to play a role in doing this alongside governments. We're committed to leading in the forums that exist, but recognize in the 21st century risks are going to emerge that require us to think differently about those challenges. We're committed to doing that with you and look forward to working with you in the months and years to come.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary, for your time and effort. And thank you for the vision of leadership you laid out. As you were kind of speaking there, it occurred to me that one of the things that will be a challenge for all of us together, and for you in particular, given the role of the United States, is to encourage the kind of flexibility of thought and innovation that I think is encapsulated in the themes that Secretary Yellen laid out yesterday. And so we will all try to rise to the challenge and look forward to partnering with you. Any final words before we wrap here?
But I just want to thank you for having me today and for having this conversation. I think the thing that I would say finally is that the United States is committed to being a leader in the world, to ensuring that we deal with the crises we face, but also the opportunities we have to make sure that we build an economy that works for everyone. Building that economy will take work. It'll take resources, it'll take our creativity. But as the president makes clear that if we do these things together, we are confident that the world that we build is better than the world that we inherited. And we look forward to working with you on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us. Your voice, your vision, your background, and your commitment going forward, I think gives us all the sense that this is a crisis, but also an opportunity that together we can seize. So you're always welcome at a Rockefeller engagement, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
So right now, thanks so much, Raj and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. Right now, we'll be going to a panel with a former UK Prime Minister and current UN Special Envoy for Education, the Right Honorable Gordon Brown. And also on this panel, we'll have the chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission and the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Jeffrey Sachs. Let's start with you, Jeffrey, if that's okay. What is the current state of vaccine distribution? We've been talking a lot about the need to expand that distribution and roll out. What is the current state of that in low and middle income countries?
Thanks very much, Eileen. As everybody knows, on the one side, and we should start with the positive side, it's amazing that we have vaccines, and not only one, but many that are effective against this disease. That was not to be taken for granted at all. This is an unprecedented rate of vaccine development. It is a great triumph of public policy and of vaccine science. And so we should hail that. Of course, what it has also meant is that in these first months of having effective vaccines, they're only reaching significant proportions of population in a very few countries. The United States, Israel, and a handful of other countries. For most countries, the amount of vaccine rollout is still very low. For many countries, it's still zero because the supplies have not been there, even though countries have signed up to the international COVAX initiative. Countries that put money into the initiative are still waiting for the vaccines to come. And even the modest flows were slowed down when India, a major producer of the vaccines, because of a surge of infection in India, put an export ban on the vaccines to increase the pace of vaccine coverage in India. It shows we have a scramble right now for a limited supply of vaccines that has the following features to it. This scramble will ease in the coming months as vaccine coverage reaches high levels in the United States and some other countries. There will be a continuing expansion of overall production in the future, and that means that the coverage of vaccines can be envisioned to be much more comprehensive worldwide. But we should also recognize that with almost 8 billion people on the planet, having complete coverage of the adult populations or populations over the age of 15 or 16, as is now being promoted in the United States, for that to occur, we need a coherent strategy for mass scale up of production and mass implementation. We need a rational strategy. And as Secretary of Treasury Yellen said yesterday, and I know I joined late and I heard that her remarks were cited, but just to emphasize, she rightly said that this is not only a humanitarian cause, it surely is that. It is the logical reality of a virus that crosses borders, of a virus that mutates, that we have an interest in comprehensive control of this pandemic everywhere, beyond the humanitarian concern, for the enlightened self-interest. We need a plan until the end of 2022. And that, to my mind, is what we can now achieve. This means 5 to 6 billion people immunized by the end of 2022. We should aim for that. That means a scaled up production flows massively, and for low and middle income countries, the financial help to make that possible. And the basic idea there is to use the upcoming $650 billion allocation of SDRs as a prime base to ensure that every country, especially the low-income countries that don't have the means on their own, as well as lower middle-income countries, especially more debt-distressed lower middle-income countries, have the wherewithal. So rational plan, coherent global cooperative response, close working relations, as hard as it seems, we need it, of China, Russia, the European Union, the UK, the United States, India, and others, so that we have a pathway and a timeline for production of the billions and billions of doses needed and their distribution, and that we have a coherent financial plan in order to implement this. It would be unprecedented, but we can do it, and we should do it.
So, Gordon, you were intimately involved in the International Finance Facility for Immunization that's helped mobilize more than $3 billion for vaccines to date. Why hasn't IFM been leveraged for COVID? And what role can similar guarantee schemes play? And how does that fit in with the SDRs? How do we guarantee that the money that we're talking about from the SDRs that's needed, some $55 billion, how do we guarantee that it's used for vaccinations and for purchasing and also for distribution?
So let me first of all build on what Jeffrey has said with such eloquence as usual about the need for action. And let me thank Rockefeller, because this is a great document you've produced today. It's going to lead the debate, and I want to thank Raj Shah for his leadership in all that. And we've had a very good discussion. What I think we've got to realize is we need a global growth plan. So we need to have the G7, the G20, leading on to COP26, with a global growth plan that is comprehensive, includes a green recovery, includes infrastructure expenditure increasing in every continent, and has its center, of course, the solution to the vaccination problem. And that, I believe, is not going to be so much supply, because I think we'll solve the problem of supply quite quickly. It's going to be a problem of funding. So what you've said today is SDRs are a possible funding mechanism. The stretching of the World Bank and IMF balance sheets are another possible funding mechanism. But I would raise two issues, and this is why hearing the new Deputy Secretary today makes me very pleased that America is back leading on the international stage. We need two things, I think, in addition to what Jeffrey and I have been talking about. One is we need to understand there's got to be equitable burden sharing. And I think this is missing at the moment from the debate. We're trying to find out where the resource is going to come from. Someone has got to pay in the end. And so we need to understand what the relative contributions of each country are going to be. When smallpox was eradicated from the 1960s onwards, there was an agreement to have an equitable sharing of the burden through a levy. The UN is partly financed through that. The World Health Organization partly financed through that. We should look at the G7, at how these major rich countries can pay probably 60% of the cost of vaccination of the rest of the world. And let's remember, if we vaccinate the West, but we vaccinate only a fraction of Africa and Asia, then we will not only be accused of vaccine apartheid, that some get the vaccine and others are left out completely, but it will come back to haunt us all as the disease mutates and the contagion hits the West as well as the rest of the world. So we need, first of all, I think, to understand that there's got to be an agreement on equitable burden sharing, and I would go for that at the G7. The second thing is we will need continuous finance. This is not a one-off. The vaccination program is not just this year or this month. It's going to be several years ahead. And so we need sustained financing. And so we have got to look at these innovative finance facilities. And I come to IFM. Now, IFM, I helped set up. And that was a mechanism by which we front-loaded expenditure on vaccination. So we could vaccinate 100% of the people in 1 year instead of 20% every year for 5 years. So countries agreed to pay the interest on loans that were taken out over 10, 20, 30 years. And that's raised several billion pounds. There is another mechanism that Jeffrey and I also know about, and that is mainly for middle-income countries. Low-income countries, it's got to be grants. You can't give them loans for this. It's got to be grants, and Jeffrey would agree with me on this. As far as middle-income countries, I think we could generate a large amount of resources through guarantees from the richest countries, including America and the European countries, that would then be leveraged up in the form of resources that either the World Bank or development banks or some agency would then put towards vaccination. So give you an example, $1 billion of guarantees, 200 million of grants given the current interest rates could create 4 to 5 billion of extra resources. So 2 billion would create nearly 10 billion of extra resources through a guarantee-based facility. And of course, that would be 5 times what had been committed in terms of guarantees and about 20 times what had been committed in terms of public spending. Now, this could be done to pay for year 1, 2, 3. So you have continuous finance for vaccination over the next few years. Now, it is a method I believe could be applied to environmental finance and applied also to education finance, which was my first intention when we devised this idea. But we've got to look innovatively at how quickly we can create substantial resources. I'm talking about billions and not hundreds of millions. And we cannot anymore rely on having international meetings where, as I remember, you go around with a begging bowl. It's like a charity fundraiser. You're just trying to get people to give money. You've got to have an understanding of how the burden should be shared equitably.
Mm-hmm. And Gordon, what about the role of the private sector? And I want to go to you as well, Jeffrey, after this, and talking about that in terms of activating a vaccination, a global vaccination program. But in terms of financing, what's the role of the private sector? And Janet Yellen also talked about the Bretton Woods institutions. And I'd love to ask you, Gordon, you just talked about, kind of innovative financing, use of guarantees, mixed resources. As Bretton Woods, the traditional way we've thought about those things, outdated? And should there be kind of a revision to that and to those global institutions? Should we start talking about that as well?
Well, the Center for Global Development has today published a document showing how the IMF could do more, and I'm sure it can. The World Bank, it seems to me, could stretch its resources. It could borrow on IDA. It could enhance IDA further. It could merge IDA and IBRD. It could have a recapitalization. All these things are possible, and I would like to see some initiative from the World Bank about what it needs over these next few years. But the advantage of the innovative finance facilities that I'm talking about is you don't need every shareholder to vote for this. This would be a number of countries coming together with the resources to give guarantees. They are below budget line items, so that they're not counted against public expenditure, these guarantees, at least in European statistics. And therefore, you could generate a lot of resources very quickly. So I would say the World Bank could probably put 10 billion more in now. But I also think you're going to need sustained finance over the next few years. And we've really got to look innovatively at how we can create these resources. The important thing is you front load so that you can actually get 100% vaccinated instead of 20% with the funds you've got, and you have sustained funding. Both of these things are absolutely essential.
And we've had some private, before I go to you, Jeffrey, we've had some private banking institutions come in with some ideas discussed broadly in our report. Is that a potential role for the private sector if this public funding it goes first? And is there more of a chance that the private sector would come in with some kind of guarantees as well?
Well, we're asking the public sector is asking the private sector to invest in these facilities. So it is a joint public-private partnership. Maybe Jeffrey's got something more to say about it, but we would be inviting in private money to help us deliver these vaccinations very quickly.
And Jeffrey, what's the role of the private sector in sort of boosting the vaccination campaign? And why has ACT-A and COVAX thus far, their planning is only around vaccinating 20% by the end of 2022? Is that because of their perception of what vaccine supplies would be, or the finance would be, or the delivery would be? And how do we boost that to the 70% we've called for in the report?
I think we should first recognize that there really isn't a public sector separate from a private sector when it comes to the vaccines. At least there should not be one, because the governments were behind so much of the vaccine development over the years. This has been a shared operation, and the private companies, while they have done a good job to develop the vaccines, they have ridden on public funding massively and public support massively. Okay, that's good. That means responsibility on all sides. The reason why COVAX initially aimed for 20%, now they've raised it to 27% in the most recent variant, is that they felt that first, pragmatically, do something. And 20% was the high priority coverage at the start. So they picked 20% because those were the frontline workers, the health workers, the most vulnerable population. Then, because of the variants and because of the success of these early vaccines, and because the United States, for example, said we're going for comprehensive coverage, COVAX had to think again and realize, under pressure also from the whole world, no, we need a higher target. But then they face the pragmatic issue that they don't even have the funding for 2021. And so they felt tactically that it was difficult for them to start talking about universal coverage. I have a different view. Since they are the center of this enterprise, I want to hear from them what's needed, not what they view as politically expedient or tactically smart vis-a-vis donors. But it was a kind of balancing act, which is we need to do more, we should do more, but we're not even funded for 2021. Suffice it to say, at this moment, we should have the clarity of our situation worldwide to say we need a plan now through at least the end of 2022 for universal coverage. And at the table need to be the companies that produce this, need to be companies that can scale up to produce more, because we can bring more production and have to online, the governments and the public health community looking at this viral mutation risk, looking at these dangerous new variants to give us the rational approach. I think that this is basically a rapidly evolving global crisis, and I was very gratified by what Treasury Secretary Yellen said yesterday. It's as clear as can be. The stakes are so high. We need to approach this rationally. By the way, we have in the United States I would say a Neanderthal part of our politics, but that is so unfair to the Neanderthals. We have a part of our politics which is just bloody minded, that are telling the Treasury Secretary, why do you care about the rest of the world? It would be immoral if it were just on morals. But from a practical point of view, it is mind-bogglingly stupid. And I'm sorry to say it, but we have to grow up in the United States. And some of these Republicans have to understand we're trying to stay alive. And so this kind of partisan bickering is going to kill us all unless we get serious about a rational strategy. Then let me add one more point about the financing. We now have 500 people in the world that have made $2 trillion in the last 12 months of net wealth. 500 people whose net worth is $8 trillion this morning. So could a few of them, in addition to Bill Gates, stand up and say, yeah, we're in for the next $10 billion, because we actually need the funding and they don't need all $8 trillion. So we're in a global emergency where it's not even the super rich, it's an unimaginable amount of wealth is just quiet. They're going to the moon, they're doing moonshots, they're doing other things. How about saving Earth itself? And so this is actually a good time to put in some money into saving Earth. And since we're in the middle of the largest pandemic in modern history, I think they have a signal of where that might be helpful.
And Gordon, Secretary Yellen talked about a lot, and obviously President Biden and others in Europe and elsewhere have talked about these new stimulus funds and just the need to build back better. And so what does better look like? What is, she talked about we can't return to the status quo. We can't return to before. What does better look like?
Well, you're going to need a new social contract because the workers we've valued least have been the workers that have done most to save lives and to help the economy keep moving during the recession. So I think poverty, inequality is a huge issue now, and it's got to be addressed domestically. I think globally, I think we've got to recognize that there are now global problems that need global solutions. A century ago, everybody would think of every problem as domestic, and you would think that the only thing that would worry you internationally was the possibility of a war with your neighbor. Now, climate change, tax avoidance, pandemics, growth itself, trade, they're all global problems that can't be addressed by even the richest country in the world, even the most powerful in its own. And we've got to understand how we need to work together to solve these problems. So I would hope that by the time we've got 3 events in the next few months, we've got the G7, which I believe should agree a funding system for vaccines. We've got the G20, which I think should agree a global growth plan, and that should lead on to the COP26 a few days later in Glasgow, which should agree that what resources we invest in future. During the financial crisis, I think we got to 15% of the resources that we spent in recovery were invested in green projects, and that was not good enough. That was very poor. It should be at least 50% of the resources that we spend in the next few years have got to be invested in environmentally sustainable projects. And therefore, you've got, I think, people working together for a fairer, a greener, and a safer and healthier world. And I think there is so much goodwill behind that, and behind President Biden's presidency and for the leadership on these issues, that Europe, America, and I believe China can be brought in to this dialogue that ought to lead to a clear plan to raise global growth levels, to deliver the 150 million who've been taken into poverty out of poverty and to reduce poverty levels around the world. And of course, to deal with some of the issues that Janet Yellen raised yesterday, global tax avoidance, because it's not just that we have large inequalities, we've got an unwillingness on the part of countries at the moment to deal with the tax evasion and tax avoidance that's depriving every exchequer of billions of dollars over the years. So something has got to be done by international cooperation to deal with these problems. And I think these 3 conferences this year should be our target. And that's why Rockefeller today, with this program, which is related to the IMF and World Bank meetings, but then to the G7 and the G20, you're starting a process that I think should lead to very substantial pressure for the G7 and the G20 and COP26 to be effective instruments of making the world a safer, fairer, and of course, greener place.
And Jeffrey, I want to ask
I want to agree with every word of that. Okay.
It's always working with you, Jeffrey.
Okay, and so I just want to say, Jeffrey, do you have any last words before I let Gordon also, just any last words that we've missed?
Well, I want to agree with what Gordon said, which is to take this year to end this scourge, but also to understand what we have learned from it, cooperate, and build a more resilient, fairer society. And we have lots of opportunities this year diplomatically. By all means, let's avoid new conflicts. Let's avoid a Cold War between the US and China, the most unspeakably bad idea that I know of in the world. Let's cooperate together and use these international institutions to do what they are designed to do. And they're there, and they can be mobilized for this purpose. Kristalina Georgieva's leadership at the IMF is exemplary. And that's why we are as far as we are towards an IMF role in this. I believe, like Gordon, that the multilateral development banks, and I would emphasize, in addition to the World Bank, and I know Gordon very much agrees with this, all of the regional development banks, Inter-American, African, Asian, have a huge potential. And I'd like to see them up capitalized in addition to making as much use as they can of their current balance sheets. I think by putting in every dollar we put into these banks, we get many, many dollars out of new borrowing and lending capacity for this kind of transformation. We should be using these multilateral institutions to the hilt right now. They were made for this purpose, and let's use them.
So, Gordon, last words?
Well, I'd be very practical. Follow through on what Rockefeller has proposed today. Let's see if we can get the SDRs working to release resources for poorer countries to vaccinate. Let's see if we can stretch the World Bank's balance sheet and recapitalize it. Let's see if the IMF can release resources under its Poverty and Growth Reduction Trust Fund. And let's see if we can get an equitable burden sharing, because I think that is the key to continuing financing of the vaccination program. You can't just rely on someone coming to the meeting and giving you a few dollars. You've got to have a plan, and it's got to be equitable. And then let's look at these innovative facilities, because they can release resources quickly, and they can also maximize the use of public funds. When I talk about the public-private partnership, 150 billion in aid money, but you need trillions to be able to deliver the sustainable development goals. So you've got to find a way of using aid money, philanthropy, remittances. You've got to find a way of using them more effectively. And there the private sector must have a role. We can talk about social impact funds and about how they can actually make a huge difference. But we've got to think about how public money can go further so that we can not only have the vaccination program, but we can deal with the health problems that we still have right around the world, and also, of course, deal with the recovery. So these are big issues. And I think, the slogan throughout the ages, from Athens onwards, united we stand, divided we fall. We've got to recognize that we've had a year last year where people failed to work together. It was a disaster for international cooperation. We need a year this year where people realize that our interdependence and our openness can be mobilized effectively for good, and we can actually make a big difference. And Raj Shah and the Rockefeller Foundation is leading the way on this, and I want to congratulate all of you on what you've achieved.
Well, thank you so much. And really, thank you for joining us, and also for your continued work with us on these issues. We do appreciate it, and we couldn't really do this without you. And I would also say to our global audience that's out there, this report represented a call to action, and it's a call to action that we hope that you all will join in supporting, because it is through popular support that these things get done. So please continue to follow the Rockefeller Foundation and these reports. We will be trying to work with others, the international organizations, to help work out some very specific plans on vaccination, and also on our green recovery plans. So thank you so much for joining us today, and goodbye.